This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today is Chase Oliver. Chase is a longtime libertarian activist and is currently running to become the nominee for the presidential candidate of the Libertarian Party. He played a major role in the outcome of the Georgia Senate race in the fall of 2022 and has a detailed vision for the future of the United States of America. Chase, welcome to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Happy to have you. Or happy to be here, rather.
Hey, it's great to have you here. Now, before I get started, I have to do this thing because the IRS is terrible, where I tell all my guests that the Libertarian Christian Institute is a 501c3 nonprofit organization and does not endorse any political party or candidate for any political, government, or party office. Guest appearances or interviews of any incumbents, officials, or candidates for any political party or government office should not be construed as endorsements or not endorsements. So there you go. I hate to have to do that to you so early in the episode, but yeah, it's the IRS for you right there. So, and I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit later on. But before we get started, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and your work.
Yeah, so my name is Chase Oliver. I'm a resident of Atlanta, Georgia. And I was the U.S. Senate candidate last year, as you said. In 2022, I forced the runoff between Herschel Walker and Raphael Warnock. And, my professional background is most recently I spent 6 years in the maritime trade industry, moving product from one part of the globe to the other, having to deal with a lot of issues, particularly with U.S. Customs. That was kind of the area that I focused on. And then before that, I spent 13 years in the restaurant industry, doing everything from being a dishwasher all the way up to being a general manager who helps open brand new restaurants. And so both of those things involve me committing to service and communicating with people. And it's something that's really helped me jump right into politics and be ready to go.
Yeah, well, last fall, you really came across my radar. You played a really big role in the Georgia Senate race. Tell us that story because it's pretty wild, and there are maybe people in my audience that don't know that story.
Yeah, so to preface it, in the state of Georgia, we have runoff rules. So if no candidate in a particular race gets over 50% of the vote, they eliminate everybody else but the top two, and they go to a top two runoff a few weeks later. And so in the Senate race this past year, there was the Democrat incumbent, Raphael Warnock. There was Herschel Walker, the football legend, who was the Republican nominee. And I was the Libertarian nominee. And because of that race, I managed to keep both of the other two under 50%, because about 81,000 folks came out and voted for me. And in doing so, I forced the runoff, which got a lot of attention to the Libertarian Party and the Libertarian message. And I utilized that to the best of my ability to give us as much positive media as I could. And that's kind of why I jumped right off of that campaign and right into this campaign, because, as long as it's like riding a bike, as long as you don't get off, you keep pedaling, you're good. That's kind of how I'm approaching this. I jumped right from a Senate campaign now to campaigning all over the country to be our presidential nominee. So it was the honor of my life to represent the state of Georgia, the Libertarian Party, as our nominee for that Senate race.
And you got over 80,000 votes, which is pretty big for a Libertarian candidate.
Yeah, it was just over 2% of the vote, which is, I was in the top tier of the Libertarian candidates this cycle for our state. We had a couple that were a little bit above me, but I was the only one to force a runoff and in doing so get that attention. But we had a really great slate of candidates. But yeah, 2% and 81,000 votes is doing pretty well for the Libertarians.
Yeah. So as you said before, you immediately jumped into a presidential run. So what is motivating you right now to run for president?
Well, really, I think it's time that my generation, millennials, really start getting involved in the political process more than we have in the past. I really feel like there's a generational shift when you see the two parties are putting up politicians whose, their youth was in the 20th century. Whereas those of us who are millennials and Gen Z, we're the generation for the last 20 years has been sent all over the world fighting the war on terror. We're the generation that had to suffer the 2008 housing crisis and the banking crisis. And we're still trying to recover from that and get our first homes and get our families right and find education for our kids that's valuable and not just state-run education. And so, there's concerns for our generation that the two parties are just not meeting. And so I thought, it's about time that libertarians provide that real contrast and try to get a generational shift involved and start investing in the Gen Z vote. If we don't start talking to those younger voters now, we risk losing them in future cycles. And they're going to be our largest voting bloc in 10 years. So not even just millennials, it's time for Gen Z to start rising up and being involved in the political process. And I know the Libertarian Party is the best vehicle to challenge the two-party system. And so I want to make sure voters have that choice.
I love it. Well, if you become president, there's obviously a lot of issues that you're going to be facing. And so I want to talk about a couple of those and just get your perspective on them. I think right now, one of the most important issues, not just for libertarians, but for everybody, is the war in Ukraine. What's your read on what's going on there? What has the government got right or wrong? And how would your presidency handle that particular issue?
Yeah, so we can look at it from like the bird's eye view, which is, libertarians do oppose wars of aggression. And I think it's important for us to call out the fact that Russia is the one who crossed the sovereign border into Ukraine to initiate this war. You can talk about the past or whatever with what happened, but in this reality and what's going on right now, this is a war of aggression caused by Russia. That does not mean that the United States needs to involve itself or put its footprint or its money behind it. I don't support compulsory military aid going to Ukraine. I do, however, support refugee efforts. I think the best thing our government should be doing is encouraging any refugees who want to get out of Ukraine or Russia, dissidents who don't want to fight in this war for Russia, who want to escape that oppressive state. They should be allowed to come here. That's the best thing that we can do as a nation, is help those who want to escape the war zone get out of there. And then I also do support, if you're a private citizen and you want to go over and fight in Ukraine, or if you have millions of dollars lying around and you want to throw some money over there, I think you should be allowed to. I just don't think that our government should be compelling us to, particularly because there are people who oppose war who pay taxes. And, I'm one of them. I don't really want to see more war in the world. And I like I said, private people can do what they do. I don't want our government to get involved.
I know that there is a NATO summit happening this week as we're having our recording, and there's going to be a vote as to whether or not Ukraine should be included in NATO. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think basically if you follow the NATO charter, they shouldn't be allowed on the basis of, it says if there's territorial disputes or a conflict going on in your country, you can't be admitted. And so I think if NATO is going to stand by its own standards, there's no way you can admit Ukraine, even if you wanted to. Strategically, do I think that's a bad thing? Yes, because if you do, it's going to immediately cause a European war. If Ukraine becomes part of NATO, there's a war going on with Russia. If they become a NATO nation, NATO is compelled to act. And so I don't think that that's the best course of action. And I think if we are just seeing NATO following its own policy, that won't happen because there's a territorial dispute. I mean, even before this war, there was already a territorial dispute over Crimea in Ukraine, which would have prevented them from joining NATO. So I think in this summit, I don't think we're going to be seeing NATO or Ukraine admitted into NATO. And I don't think if they were, that would be strategically wise.
Yeah, I mean, my entire life, we've been at war in the Middle East, and that's just, unfortunately, the reality. And so I think it's very fair to characterize the United States as a warfare state at this point, and I think that that's something that, like, all libertarians fundamentally agree on. How would you, as president, go about rolling back that warfare state?
So first thing you would do as president is immediately cease the drone operations that have been going on and then start to peel back the military footprint. Particularly, I would start moving soldiers out of Syria, out of the Middle East, and bring them back home. And then you start the process of closing these bases in areas that they don't need to be having bases, that aren't strategically advantageous. There's just a lot of reasons. We don't need to have the world's largest green zone in Baghdad. Like, there's reasons to scale back all of that footprint immediately. That's what you have to start doing. But on day one, you cease the drones, because that is drone warfare is a particularly immoral form of warfare to me. It creates so much civilian casualties. So I know that you can do that on day one as president, but from that on, you have to get the Joint Chiefs and your Department of Defense together and say, you're going to present me a plan to start rolling back this today. And we have 6 months to get out of every major theater of war that we're in right now. And I would compel the Congress to start cutting the Pentagon's budget to match that.
Yeah, man, I love it. That sounds like a great strategy there. Of course, the other main issue of our time is COVID. So I kind of want to do this in a couple of steps. What do you think the government got wrong in 2020 and 2021 in their response to the pandemic?
Okay, so there's several steps. There's a lot right there that you can unpack. First and foremost, there was the need to clamp down on any kind of information that wasn't coming from official government channels. Whether the government was right or wrong, when you do that, it actually compels people to not trust you and creates distrust. So even if they were saying the right thing, right, when you crack down on any kind of other information coming out outside of official government channels, you are creating a natural distrust. The other major, and in doing so, you're cracking down on, the ability to have investigatory, all this kind of other things that make people have more trust in the system, right? Another thing is they really screwed up on testing because the FDA bungled testing. They basically they were so slow to react to getting tests approved that by the time they did, it didn't really matter. There was no containing COVID in the U.S. anymore. And so that was a major bungle. And then, of course, lockdowns, compulsory lockdowns were so arbitrary and brutal to so many small businesses and to so many people who were just trying to make a living. A great example I use is I have a family member who was a florist. She owned a flower shop. Her flower shop was shut down because it was not deemed an essential service. But the Lowe's down the street, who had a garden center completely open, well, they were deemed fine because they sold certain items that were deemed essential. So my family member's flower business goes out of business, but the Lowe's, they can keep selling begonias all day long. And so that kind of arbitrary top-down lockdown strategy was just so damaging to our economy, to the people, and to the trust that people have in any kind of official channels, which is actually kind of one of the silver linings is that people distrust government more now than they used to. So always try to find the silver lining in that cloud, I suppose.
Yeah. So what do you think about the people that were involved? Because I know that there have been a lot of calls for people like Anthony Fauci and state governors. I know I'm from Kentucky and our governor was absolutely horrible on COVID. And a lot of the decisions that he made were probably extra constitutional. Do you think there's any sort of benefit in trying to prosecute those people, or what how do we find justice for what happened during that time?
So, as far as prosecutions, you have to build a case, right? And so, if you are a president, you're going to be wanting to ask the Department of Justice to look and see what any kind of illegality or extra constitutional measures were taken. And then you would prosecute accordingly, right? You can't just pull out charges out of a hat. So you actually have to go through the process of investigating. And that is something that I think that everyone involved in the pandemic should be, from the Trump administration on through the Biden administration. There was a lot of wrongdoing going on. There was also a lot of being ham-fisted and kind of collusion with big pharma, and I think that deserves to be investigated too. But at the same time, I also think that we need to really, if we're looking for restitution, we need to be looking for restitution of rights. We need to be peeling back the emergency powers that government granted itself in the wake of COVID. That's something we never did post 9/11, and we're still suffering from that. And so if we really want to get justice without having to go into a courtroom, we need to insist that the Congress and whoever our president is repeals and peels back those emergency powers, because that's ultimately a way we can get justice immediately that doesn't necessarily involve investigations and prosecutions. And while you're doing that, you can also be building your case to prosecute those who maybe violated the law in the wake of the pandemic.
Yeah. So let's say you become president in 2024, and there's always the possibility of a pandemic along the lines of COVID-19. What would you do differently if you had to deal with a crisis like that as president?
Well, again, first and foremost, you would not start cracking down on other people disseminating information. You would allow for a free market exchange of ideas. So that way you're creating more trust when you say something. It's not because, and somebody refutes you, you don't just go, well, they're wrong and I'm shutting it down. You can actually provide a proper refute to their case and bolster yours, right? That's how you create trust, is through discourse. And then another thing is I would not be insisting on mandatory lockdowns. I think that ultimately that's just an immoral and not a very effective way to be combating disease. And then I would also be ensuring that people have the choice to make they want, with regards to medication. I'm not a ivermectin or a hydrochloroquine guy, but I guess if people want to try medications, they should be allowed to, and really get the FDA out of the way of taking it so long to get things approved, treatments, and even vaccines approved. I think that there are ways to have efficacy and things like that beyond this. Ideally, if I were president, I would have time to dismantle the FDA and have a better process before the next pandemic hits. But let's say it happens on day one, I would immediately cut as much red tape out of the FDA as possible to streamline any kind of therapy as quickly as possible. and understand that it's more about it's more about safety, not about efficacy when it comes to approving drugs, right? And I think that's where the real big problem is. And so, ideally, if on day one a pandemic happens, you're going to see a quicker government response and one that is less cracking down on people's liberty and freedom of speech and the freedom to congregate. You know, hopefully we won't ever have a pandemic like this again, but that's hoping for something that's probably not going to happen. We will likely one day have a pandemic again.
Yeah. The other major issue that's been concerning me lately is kind of this push towards kind of like a World Economic Forum type of globalism. And that organization, I've done a couple of episodes where we've talked about the WEF and we've talked about ESG scores, the way that these people that aren't really government authorities, but they're connected with a lot of governments, are trying to micromanage the world and push world governments and the world economy in a certain direction. What are your thoughts on the World Economic Forum and globalism in general? And how would you handle that kind of rising tide of globalist sentiment as a libertarian president?
Well, as a free marketer, honestly, globalism, and like I said, maybe this comes from the fact that I worked in maritime trading for so much, but I actually love the idea of global trade. Maybe not, I don't support one world government, but I absolutely support the idea that people should trade with one another and we should be engaging as much free market trade. I think the world's more peaceful and prosperous when we do that. And so that's what we should be facilitating. The World Economic Forum, don't give a lot of thought to that kind of stuff because it's a giant think tank full of a bunch of overpaid elites. I imagine, they're going to have their opinions on things, but really the best indicator is not going to come from the World Economic Forum. It's going to come from the trillions of individual market decisions that people make all over the world. And that's what we need to be facilitating. One thing that I do love as a private citizen and that I advocate as a private citizen to help bolster markets around the world is actually microlending. I love the idea of loaning money into the developing economies, allowing those economies to grow and then pay you back, and then you can then loan it back out again. That's a much better way than, say, foreign aid to actually create marketplaces in the developing world so that we have more trading partners here in the U.S.
Yeah. So what are some of the other major issues that you would want to address if you became president?
Oh, so some big issues are particularly I want to get spending under control because inflation is still growing. It is still a concern. But also we have a major debt and deficit crisis that's going to be affecting our generation, millennials and Gen Z, far more than it's affecting those who are currently in power right now. So that would be something I would really want to address. Excuse me. And then two issues that are very close to my heart and that I really want to address is immigration. We have to solve the immigration crisis in this country, because it is a human rights crisis. If we don't simplify and make it easier for people to come here and work, it makes it much harder for us to focus on the actual human traffickers and people who are abusing people by coming across the border. And also, we have an issue where we have millions and millions of people who just want to come here and work and put down roots. And because of our complicated government process, that is made harder. And it's created a shadow economy. And here's the big thing that I tell people all the time. How many immigrant wives and kids are being abused, but they're too scared to go to the police because they know they might get deported if they do? Those are the real kind of human concerns about immigration that I think about. And then lastly, justice reform is a huge issue that's always been close to my heart. Maybe it's because I've been tear gassed by the police as I'm protesting it, but I have a real anti-authority streak when it comes to justice reform. One of the things I'm doing right now in Atlanta actually is trying to oppose the building of what's called Cop City. It'll be the largest police training facility in the country. And so actually, after we get off this podcast, I'm heading out to go get petition signatures to help get a referendum on the ballot to cancel it. So those are my three biggest issues: the debt and the deficit, immigration reform, and the need to reform our justice system.
All right. I love it. I love it. Well, how does a libertarian presidency look different from that of a Republican or a Democrat? Like, what would be unique about having a libertarian in the presidential office?
So I think the first thing you're going to see is if you have a libertarian as the chief executive, you're going to have to see more coalition building coming between Republicans and Democrats. It won't just be like my side's in charge so we can do whatever we want and your side sucks, so you guys just have to eat it. It'll actually force the two other parties to actually have to come together and work together to actually bring legislation to the table that's libertarian in scope that can get the president's signature on the ballot. So you're actually going to have an adult in the room when it comes to those negotiations, as opposed to just two sides of monkeys throwing poo at each other, right? So I think that's one big thing that's going to change. Another thing you would see is a major change in the use of executive power. I tell people all the time, if I'm elected president, I'm going to be a weaker president the day I leave office than the day I started, because I'm going to start dismantling my own power. Um, but the one power I'm definitely going to use on day one that will look very different. I won't wait until my last day in office to start pardoning people. I'll pardon people on day one. On day one, Edward Snowden's getting a pardon. On day one, Julian Assange is getting a pardon. On day one, Ross Ulbricht is getting a pardon. On day one, all nonviolent drug offenders who are in federal prison, whether it's for cannabis, cocaine, or whatever, you're getting out and you're going home, and you're going to be able to restart your life. And I think that's something that's going to be a very huge contrast, is that I will use those powers in a way that isn't just like bailing out my politically connected buddies.
Yeah, man, I love that. That's a great answer there. Well, talk to us a little bit about religious freedom. Why is it so important to you, and how would you as a president help preserve it, especially considering that there has been a push, at least in some places around the country, and even in my state during COVID, our governor, he basically issued this order where the churches were required to shut down, and he had police officers go out and record the license plate numbers of people that tried to go to church during COVID. So there have been a lot of these kind of issues going around our country. How do we preserve religious freedom, and why is it so significant?
So I just want to say my background, I grew up in the evangelical tradition, and, you can see the rainbow flag behind me. I'm LGBTQ. And so sometimes that created a conflict when I was younger. And it took me a long time before I found the church that I'm a member of, which is the Episcopal Church. They welcomed and affirmed me. And one of the reasons why I respect religious freedom is because if we didn't have a true religious freedom in this country, I would have never been able to go find the church that felt right to me. And I understand that there's a church that feels right to everyone, and that each person's faith tradition is their own faith journey. And I can respect that. And I think that that's something that is wholly sacred to each and every individual. And so when it comes to protecting religious freedom, that's protecting part of your core identity, is your faith tradition or lack thereof. You can also be a non-believer too and be free in this country. And that's a good thing. And why is faith so important to me? Because in my faith, I understand what true compassion is, true empathy, true love. Like, these are the values that religion and faith has given me that I then put out into the world, both in my political life, but also just in my normal life. It's taught me to look at each and every person with a loving heart, to understand that each and every person comes from a different place, and that I'm commanded by Jesus Christ to respect and to affirm those people, and to understand that all journeys are different, and that that's okay. And that is one of the reasons why I love my church and why I love my faith tradition, is because it is one that allows me to respect the rights of all people to live their lives and to love all people regardless. And so I think those are values that are so important to me, that if an institution tried to strip it away, it's so insulting and degrading to people to be told that you can't go to church, that you can't practice your faith in the way that you want to. And I think in the wake of COVID, that was one of the worst things, was seeing churches shut down. Even churches that adapted, right? There were churches that had to change. They did outdoor churches, these kinds of things. And I'm happy that our faith leaders around the country did what they could, even in the wake of government oppression, to adapt and make sure that they were shepherds to their flock. And so, I, as president, would never, ever seek to lock down churches. It's something that I think is just wholly unconstitutional. There's a clear separation between church and state. And it's something that I would not seek to cross as a politician.
Yeah. Oh, I love that answer. That was great, man. Well, what does libertarianism mean to you? Because I know that there are a lot of, especially within the Libertarian Party right now, there are kind of a lot of different interest groups that have different definitions of what it means to be libertarian. So for you, when you think about your libertarianism, what do you mean by that?
Yeah. So ultimately, libertarianism to me is a governing philosophy that says that if you are living your life in peace without harming people through force, fraud, coercion, or theft, you should not be impacted by government as much as possible. That the impact of government on your life, if you're living as a peaceful individual, should be minimal at most. And that is ultimately the philosophy of where I come from. And because of that, it leads me to things like free market economics, being open-minded and socially tolerant of all kinds of people, and then all the other policies that come along with that. And so, but at the core of it is, if you're living your life in peace, government shouldn't be impeding on that as much as possible. And that's kind of where I kind of draw my inspiration as a libertarian. That's what it means to me. But ultimately, that reflects itself in all kinds of ways, from again, like I said, free market economics, all the way to the right to defend yourself with a firearm, right? So like those all fall under that umbrella of, if you're not hurting anybody, you shouldn't be oppressed by government.
Yeah, I love it. Well, there are, as you know, a lot of divisions within the Libertarian Party, and it seems like the main fault line now is between kind of like the Mises Caucus wing of the party and the classical liberal wing of the Libertarian Party. And so you have, like the Mises Institute on one side, Reason Magazine on the other, and there's a lot of infighting based on those two paths. But as I'm looking at the Libertarian Party, like ultimately, I feel like each wing within libertarianism they all have more in common with each other than they do with the Republicans or the Democrats. So how do we go about bridging the gap between those kind of different sectors within the Libertarian Party?
Yeah, well, I can say as a candidate, ultimately my job as a candidate is to not be inwardly fighting. It's to be outwardly focusing on the state and on the two-party system that we're combating. And so I really don't like to see as much infighting as we've seen, particularly in the last few years. I think really since 2016, it's been kind of a downward spiral in terms of infighting. And, that's just, that's concerning. And I think the way I, as a candidate, try to get past that is try to say that I'm here to broadly represent the Libertarian Party in general. I'm not here to represent one wing or one caucus or one thought philosophy. I'm here to be a broad umbrella. And our presidential candidate ultimately is a brand officer. It's our job to present the Libertarian brand in a way that is attractive to as many people as possible to get them in the tent. And then if they find a caucus or a wing once they're in here, that's its own internal thing. But as a candidate, my job is just to make sure that we present this philosophy and this party in the best light possible so that the most people can come in and take a look. Because if we're not doing that, if we're not marketing ourselves outward as candidates, the infighting really doesn't matter, because ultimately it's going to continue to shrink and shrink and shrink. And that's what we've seen, unfortunately, in the last couple of years, is we've seen a major shrinkage in members and enthusiasm. And I think a lot of that has to do with this infighting mentality. And I think it's high time, really, before the 2024 election, we libertarians have to snap out of it and understand that infighting as a recruiting tactic for your caucus isn't the best way to do it, because ultimately it's leading to a smaller and smaller echo chamber. And I want to grow our influence. I do not want to become a small social club. I want to become a large, active political body that's electing libertarians all across the country.
Yeah, let's talk about the logical path to the presidency for a libertarian candidate. The reality is, regardless of what you think about what happened in 2020, is that every election is really rigged by the two-party system. They do everything they can to exclude third-party candidates, from making it almost impossible for a libertarian presidential candidate to make it to the debate stage, and between the way that states organize certain ballot access laws. Like, the two parties control our system, and they make it almost impossible for anyone else to break in. So parties like the Libertarian Party, they have to be very strategic in the way that they run these campaigns. So what's the logical, rational path for a libertarian candidate to become the president?
Yeah, so like you said, it's a difficult road to hoe, because we're facing major competition that's very well funded. But I think the way that we start having a libertarian win the presidency is it starts looking at states that have ranked choice voting. You have Maine and Alaska. They're both states that you can put a libertarian down as your first choice. And then if you want to put a lesser of two evil down as a second choice, you can absolutely do that. I think libertarians need to be focusing on those states to show it as a proof of concept, while also encouraging ranked choice voting, approval, or any other non-plurality voting model across the country. And then I'm glad you mentioned ballot access, because one of the reasons it's important for us to be running a presidential candidate and supporting a presidential candidate is because in many states, that candidate is depending upon ballot access for the whole state. I know it's going to be in Georgia, because we're the only statewide race is president and vice president in 2024. I believe Ohio is similar. There are other states where ballot access solely depends upon the presidential and vice presidential outcome in terms of numbers of votes. And so there is that important aspect too, in terms of organizing the party on down. If we want to be able to have people running for, Congress or for more localized offices, we need to have the ballot access to do it. And then, the other path to that is really challenging the two-party system in a way that is bold and different from them. You cannot just sound like another Republican or Democrat, because that flavor, well, there's already a much more popular flavor that's got a lot more votes and money behind it. You have to sound wholly different. And that's one of the things I hope I can do as a more activist style candidate. And then, ultimately, I think the best way to challenge them is if you're not allowed on the debate stage, you better be protesting, getting ready to get arrested on that debate stage, because that's one of the things I guarantee you. If I'm our nominee and I'm not allowed in the debate and I'm on enough ballots to win the presidency, I will be out there protesting and I will get arrested trying to get in the door. And I hope the Green Party and any other minor party joins me in doing so in solidarity, because that's the way we're going to really, really shine a light on it. You have to get attention. And I'm willing to get that attention and spend a night in jail if that's what it takes.
Yeah, I love that. Well, you actually had your own kind of debate moment during the Senate race back in the fall. Could you talk about that real quick? Because I think that's important to what you're saying here.
Yeah, so I was invited to participate in one of the debates, and I debated Senator Raphael Warnock. Herschel Walker decided not to show up to that debate. I think he was a little afraid to see what like a real limited government voice sounded like and challenging him. But I did get a chance to, as a libertarian, be on a debate stage with a sitting U.S. senator and challenging his notions and challenging the fact that he doesn't even read the bills that he's voting on, that he just spouts the party line, and that he's not really doing anything useful for the voters in Georgia. So I'm somebody who has already gotten on stage with a duopolist. Let me tell you right now, if I got on stage with Joe Biden and Donald Trump, they would never know what hit them. It would be like a knockout punch because they've never, ever really had to deal with a libertarian voice. And trust me, I can tell you, I was 2 feet away from him. I could see the fear in Raphael Warnock's eyes when he realized I was not just some pushover and that I came prepared. And I know I can put that same fear in Joe Biden and Donald Trump's eyes too.
Yeah, and I mean, who was the libertarian candidate? It was in Arkansas, I think, that was also a part of those debates. Do you remember? I can't remember the guy's name.
There's Michael White, who ran for Congress, and Ricky Harrington, who ran for governor, I believe, were the two voices out there.
And dude, watching the clips of you guys debating the main party candidate, I mean, you guys just, I mean, the only way to put it is you guys beat the hell out of them. I mean, you really did. It was incredible to watch you guys up there just hitting them with principle and hitting them with logic. And you're absolutely right. Like they were incredibly, you can just tell they were squirming when you guys were talking. So I'd love to be able to see someone like you on the debate stage, because Joe Biden and Donald Trump don't stand a chance.
Yeah, I know. I did a good job in my debate when I had Republicans messaging me the next day saying, "I wish Herschel had debated like that a few days earlier." And you know, when I got messages like that, I was like, okay, I obviously made an impact on people. And you know, I even had Democrats saying that, "Wow, you really put him on his toes a lot more than Herschel did." And so I think I'm prepared if I get on a debate stage with Joe Biden or Donald Trump to take care of business, to represent the Libertarian Party well, and to really change the dynamic in this country. But I need folks' help to get there, and I need to get the nomination to get there first. So that's what I'm solely focused on right now.
Yeah, man, I'd love to see that. Well, this kind of is a good segue into my next question. What's wrong with the two-party system?
Well, it rewards complacency. It does not allow for real growth of political ideas. It kind of forces you into one box or the other. And when you do that, what you do is you really, really, it's like limiting a free market. It's like saying, oh, well, you can only have this or that. You can only have ham or turkey. You can't have anything else. And it's like, it's boring, frankly. And what it does is it what's the word I'm looking for? It just really, it makes voters feel apathetic. That's the word I'm looking for. It creates voter apathy, which is why you see so many people not even bothering to vote, because they see a failed two-party system. Like, why do I even care? Like, they both suck. And that's the real problem with the two-party system. It is not representative. It creates voter apathy. And ultimately, when you do that, it allows very powerful elites to control the narrative, to control the process. And ultimately, they win and the average Joe loses. And I think that's the real big problem, is that so many people are fooled into thinking that the Republican or the Democratic Party works for them, and that they don't. They work for giant, giant corporate interests who, at the end of the day, do not care about individual people. They care about the dollars and cents, and that is it. And I think that's really the biggest shame of the two-party system, is that it allows us to be so easily controlled by such concentrated, centralized interests.
Yeah, that's a great answer there. Well, before I let you go here, I want to kind of have a discussion about the current state of the Republican and Democratic field, and then just give you a chance to kind of compare and contrast yourself to them. So I'd love to get your thoughts on where you think this is headed. I know that there's a lot of stuff going on in the Trump camp right now, but it still seems like he is the only viable candidate, even if he has to run from a prison cell. And it's very difficult to tell whether it'll be Joe Biden, or I know that there have been people that have said that there's something will happen within the Democratic Party, and it'll be a Gavin Newsom type figure. But then you have two very interesting candidates. I think one for the Republicans, Vivek Ramaswamy, and then one for the Democrats, which is RFK Jr., who are making some noise, and they have some very compelling perspectives. What do you think about the current field of the Republican and Democratic candidates? Where do you think they lie, and what do you think we're ultimately going to be looking at in 2024?
So yeah, let's start with where I think the field's going to be. Ultimately, I think we're likely to see Biden and Trump 2.0. Like, I just do. I don't see any of the other candidates on either side breaking through. Now, let's say Biden is old, right? Let's say he gets incapacitated, or God forbid, whatever passes away, and Kamala Harris becomes president. That's really freaky. I think you're likely to see Gavin Newsom step in. I don't think Robert Kennedy is going to break through. And ultimately, because I think it's just because his base is not the Democratic Party base. And, he is an old school Democrat with some things, but with other things, he really bucks their party narrative. So I think there's compelling things about him, I'm sure. But ultimately, I disagree with him on a lot of major issues, guns being a big one, the role of government with regards to climate change being a huge one. The taxation of the rich and pay their fair share, that kind of stuff. That kind of talk is just not something that I think jives with a libertarian audience. Maybe he's, let's just say he's libertarian adjacent. Like, he's libertarian enough to have come to Porkfest, right? And then Vivek on the other side, he tries to present himself as a, businessman, free marketer, but he's also asking for the authoritarian control to say you can't vote if you're 18 unless you pass a test or do 6 months of compulsory service to the United States. I'm sorry, that sounds like straight out of Starship Troopers. Like, you can only get citizenship if you serve in the infantry, kind of a thing. That is just not compelling to me as a young person, and as somebody who has nephews and nieces who are about to be 18. I don't want them to be forced to serve in the military if they want to be able to vote. I think that's ultimately kind of crazy. And, I think he's probably a very nice guy, but I just don't see him breaking through the Republicans. Like, I see them pretty lockstep with Donald Trump. And let's say Donald Trump drops out. I clearly see that there's going to be trying to coalesce behind Ron DeSantis, which is his own flavor of authoritarianism. He loves to punish private companies who say things that he doesn't agree with. He's about to lose that lawsuit against Disney, so I don't know how viable he'll be once Mickey Mouse kicks his ass in court. But that's kind of where I see things. Right, is that it's kind of probably, unfortunately, and this is again a problem with the two-party system. You get the least interesting people. It's going to be Trump versus Biden 2.0, which is the two that neither side really wants. Like, Republicans really don't want Biden. Democrats really don't want Donald Trump. Well, right. That's who it's going to end up being. And libertarians are going to be here to provide you with a real alternative that's better than both of them.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, going back to the two-party system thing, I mean, even if it was to be like a DeSantis versus Newsom race, there's really no policy difference between Trump, Biden, and then DeSantis and Newsom, right?
Yeah, it's just window dressing mostly. Either way, you're going to get a growing federal government, growing debts and deficit, growing impact of the government in our lives, whether it be our bedrooms or the boardroom. So either way, you're going to get more authoritarian control. It just matters whether the boot that's stepping on your neck is a left boot or a right boot. I prefer to take the boot just completely off of our necks and allow us to stand up as free people.
Yeah, I love that. Well, what do you think about the libertarian field? I know that there have been a couple of other people. None of them, I think, are as high profile as you. I think of like Mike Trematt, and there's some other people that are out there running for the presidential candidacy. Do you see the possibility of like a Justin Amash or Dave Smith throwing their hat in the ring, or do you think that the libertarian field's pretty much set as it is right now?
Well, I don't want to speak to other people's motives, what they might do, but I can say there's probably likely to be a couple more people that will jump in. I don't know if it'll be Dave or Justin Amash or Spike. Those are the people that everybody speculates. But I imagine there'll be a couple more people jumping in because we're still a little bit early in the process. But I think the field is, we got a nice field of people. I see Mike and I see Lars pretty regularly as we're traveling across the country, and I'm happy to say that we can keep things on a positive keel. It's not a negative campaign season so far, and I like that. I like that we're just all putting ourselves out there and not putting each other down. So that I can say I'm very satisfied with. And, if another person jumps in the race, more power to them. May the best man or woman win, and let's do this thing. I welcome it. It's a free marketplace.
Yeah, well, Chase Oliver, this has been a great conversation, man. I really appreciate your time today. You have a very interesting candidacy, very principled. I love following you on Twitter and hearing what you have to say because it's all really good. Where can people find you, and then where can they support you?
Yeah, if you want to check out my website, it's votechaseoliver.com. You can find my issue positions, press releases, or if you want to become a donor, supporter, or volunteer, that's the place to do it. I would really welcome your support. That's how we travel across the country doing this whole thing. But then if you want to look me up on social media, I'm at Chase for Liberty on Twitter. I'm now on Threads, also on Instagram and TikTok. So look for me on all, and even on Facebook. But yeah, at Chase for Liberty is where you're going to find me on all those platforms.
All right. Well, Chase Oliver, I'm going to put all the links to those in the show notes there so people can follow you. Thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Hey, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.